The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance Holdings boardroom, mirroring the stormy silence within. Harrison Vance, a man whose cold precision had doubled his family's empire, stared down his grandfather. The ultimatum had been delivered with the casual brutality of a business transaction. Harrison had exactly 30 days to marry, or the controlling shares of the company would pass to his resentful younger brother, Silas. It was blatant blackmail, a final attempt by the dying patriarch to force a soul into his ruthless heir. Harrison did not believe in love, but he believed in power. He would not lose his empire over a trivial detail like a wedding ring. He needed a wife, someone desperate enough to sign a watertight contract and disappear when the terms were met. Miles away, the neon sign of a rundown diner flickered, casting a sickly pink glow over Clara Thorne. She wiped down the sticky counter for the 100th time, her posture straight despite the exhaustion gnawing at her bones. Clara was a survivor, stripped of her family's wealth and dignity years ago by a corporate shark she had never met. When she answered a bizarre, highly paid advertisement for a short-term executive companion, she expected an eccentric billionaire needing a +1 for a season of galas. She did not expect Harrison Vance. Their first meeting took place in an office that felt more like a vault. Harrison sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his dark eyes scanning her frayed but meticulously clean coat. He laid out the terms with icy detachment. 1 year. Complete obedience in public. $1 million deposited into her account upon dissolution. Clara did not flinch. Instead of looking away, she met his gaze with a fierce, quiet dignity that momentarily cracked his composure. She told him she would take his money, but she would not play the role of a submissive doll. She would be his wife on paper, but he would not own her voice. Harrison leaned back, a flicker of dark amusement crossing his face. For the first time in his life, a woman had looked at his wealth and found it entirely unimpressive. The wedding was a sterile affair, witnessed only by a bored judge and Silas, who stood in the corner, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Silas hated his brother's effortless dominance and had been counting on Harrison's refusal to marry. As Harrison slid a flawless, heavy diamond onto Clara's finger, Silas watched them like a hawk, searching for the crack in their performance. There was no kiss, only a stiff nod before they entered the waiting town car. Life in Harrison's penthouse was a battlefield of polite silence. He expected her to redecorate, to shop, to drain his accounts like the women before her. Instead, Clara refused his credit cards. When he bought her a wardrobe of designer gowns, she left them untouched, wearing her own simple dresses. The power dynamic shifted subtly. He could not control what he could not buy. One evening, Harrison returned from a brutal board meeting, his face pale, fighting off a severe migraine. He collapsed on the leather sofa, expecting his staff to handle him. Instead, Clara dismissed the housekeeper. She brought him a cup of chamomile tea, her fingers briefly grazing his temple as she handed it to him. The touch was light, but it burned through his defenses. He looked up, seeing the genuine care in her eyes, a stark contrast to the transactional nature of their existence. The attraction between them, long buried under pride, began to take root, but peace in the Vance household was a fragile illusion. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday. Harrison had been going through old financial archives when he recognized a name, Thorne Industries, a minor acquisition from 5 years ago, ruthlessly dismantled. He confronted Clara in the grand foyer, the documents trembling in his hand. The truth tore through the quiet room. Clara was the daughter of the man Vance Holdings had ruined, the man who had lost everything and passed away from the stress. She admitted she knew who he was when she took the job. She had wanted to see the monster who destroyed her family, perhaps even find a way to take back a fraction of what was stolen. The revelation devastated them both. Harrison, for the first time, felt the crushing weight of his company's collateral damage. Clara, staring into his stricken face, realized she no longer saw a monster, but a man she was dangerously close to loving. The rupture was immediate. They retreated to opposite ends of the massive penthouse. The silence between them grew heavy, a weapon forged from guilt and broken trust. Yet Harrison could not let her go. He began to leave small, nameless bouquets of wildflowers on the kitchen island, knowing she preferred them over extravagant roses. He quietly cancelled his evening engagements just to sit in the same room as her, reading in silence, offering his presence as a silent apology. While they suffered in their quiet war, Silas made his move. He had hired a private investigator and uncovered Clara's true identity. Seeing an opportunity to destroy Harrison's credibility and annul the marriage, Silas planned a coup. At the annual Vance Charity Gala, with the city's elite and the entire board of directors present, Silas took the microphone. He declared Harrison a fraud, presenting a thick dossier to the crowd. He painted Clara as a corporate spy, a gold digger seeking revenge, and Harrison as a compromised fool unfit to lead. The ballroom erupted in whispers. Clara stood frozen, the heavy gaze of 100 strangers pinning her down. But Harrison did not panic. He walked calmly to the stage, his presence commanding absolute silence. He did not defend himself. He turned the blade on Silas. Harrison produced his own documents, uncovered during his deep dive into the Thorn acquisition. He revealed that Silas, not Harrison, had authorized the illegal dismantling of Thorn Industries to cover up his own massive embezzlement scheme. Silas had acted behind their grandfather's back, destroying Clara's family to save his own skin. The reversal was brutal and absolute. Silas, sweating and stammering, looked around for allies, but the board members turned their backs. Security escorted a sobbing, humiliated Silas out of the very event he had tried to weaponize. Harrison stood before the crowd, but his eyes were only on Clara. When the ballroom emptied and the lights dimmed, Harrison found Clara on the terrace, looking out over the city. He did not offer her a new contract. He offered his complete surrender. He apologized, not just for the marriage of convenience, but for the sins of his family. He handed her a legal folder, transferring the newly restored Thorn Industries back into her name. It was not a gesture of purchase, but of justice. He told her he loved her, without conditions, without pride, and asked for the chance to be a husband she could choose, rather than one she was forced to endure. Months later, the cold penthouse had been transformed into a home filled with warmth and laughter. Clara ran her father's company with Harrison by her side, not as a rival, but as a partner. They stood together under a floral arch in a small, private garden, surrounded only by genuine friends. As they exchanged new, simple rings, there were no contracts, no ultimatums, and no secrets. Just a promise freely given and completely true. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time. The skyline of Manhattan looked like a scattering of diamonds against the dark velvet of the night, but Julian Ashford was not interested in the view. Standing in his glass-walled corner office, he threw the quarterly report onto his desk with a heavy sigh. The Ashford Group was on the verge of securing a multi-billion-dollar merger with a highly conservative overseas maritime company, but the deal was crumbling. The foreign investors had made their stipulations perfectly clear. They only did business with men of stable, traditional family values. Julian, with his endless rotation of high-profile brief romances, was considered a liability. His advisors had told him earlier that morning that unless he could present a respectable, devoted wife by the end of the week, the acquisition would go to his rivals. He needed a bride, one who understood the transactional nature of his world and could play the part flawlessly without expecting a fairy tale. In the outer office, Sienna Hayes methodically organized the next day's schedules. As Julian's newly hired personal assistant, she was practically invisible to him. She preferred it that way. Sienna was not there for the glamour of the corporate world. She was there for the comprehensive health insurance and the steady paycheck. She had a life outside these walls that required every ounce of her strength, a life she kept fiercely guarded. As she prepared to turn off her monitor, the heavy oak door of Julian's office swung open. He leaned against the frame, truly looking at her for the first time in 3 months. He noticed the sharp intelligence in her eyes and the way she refused to lower her gaze under his intense scrutiny. Without a word of preamble, Julian outlined his proposition. He offered her a marriage of convenience, 1 year of her life in exchange for a sum of money that would guarantee her security forever. Sienna did not gasp or blush. She calmly closed her notebook and met his cold stare with one of her own. She told him that she was not a porcelain doll to be placed on a shelf for his investors to admire. If she agreed to this absurd contract, there would be rules. She would not be humiliated in public, and she would maintain her own private life. Julian felt a strange jolt of respect. He was used to women who agreed to his every demand, desperate for a sliver of his attention. Sienna looked at him as if he was simply another demanding task on her to-do list. The papers were drawn up in total secrecy, and by Friday afternoon, they stood before a judge in a sterile municipal building, reciting vows that tasted like dry ash. Moving into Julian's sprawling penthouse felt like stepping onto a beautifully decorated battlefield. The tension between them was a living, breathing thing. Julian expected her to fall into the rhythm of his extravagant lifestyle, but Sienna refused his platinum credit cards. When he instructed his stylist to fill her closets with designer labels, Sienna calmly packed them away and continued to wear her own modest, elegant clothing. One evening, after a particularly grueling dinner with the investors, Julian poured himself a drink and ordered her to cancel her weekend plans to attend a gala. Sienna stood by the fireplace, her voice quiet but unyielding. She reminded him that she was his wife for the cameras, not his servant, and her weekends were her own. The argument that followed was sharp and filled with a strange, crackling electricity. Julian realized with a shock that he was entirely captivated by her defiance. The fragile truce shattered a few weeks later. Julian had returned from a business trip a day early, the penthouse eerily quiet. He found a strange medical receipt on the kitchen island and, driven by a sudden protective paranoia, followed the address to a quiet suburban pediatric clinic. There, looking through the glass of a waiting room, he saw Sienna. She was holding a small, sleeping boy with curly dark hair. It was her 4-year-old son, Leo. Julian felt the ground drop beneath his feet. The secret hit him like a physical blow. When Sienna returned to the penthouse that night, the confrontation was devastating. She explained that she had hidden Leo because powerful men like Julian used leverage to control people, and she would never let her son become a pawn in a billionaire's contract. Julian retreated behind a wall of pure ice. He felt manipulated, his pride wounded by the fact that the woman sleeping down the hall did not trust him at all. For days they barely spoke, communicating only in clipped, polite sentences when the staff was present. But the silence gnawed at Julian. He could not stop thinking about the fierce, protective love he had seen in Sienna's eyes when she held her child. He realized his anger was not about the lie, but about the fact that she believed he was entirely without a heart. Slowly, Julian changed his tactics. He stopped demanding her time. Instead, he made sure the kitchen was stocked with her favorite tea. One afternoon, a package arrived for Sienna. It was not jewelry, but the contact information for the top pediatric asthma specialist in the country, fully paid for, with no strings attached. It was a quiet surrender, a gesture of pure care that brought tears to Sienna's eyes. Just as the ice between them began to thaw, a shadow from Julian's past emerged. Clarissa Wade, Julian's manipulative ex-fiancée, had never forgiven him for moving on. Clarissa had hired people to watch him, desperate to find a weakness. She discovered the truth about the contract and the existence of little Leo. Clarissa saw her chance to destroy Sienna and force Julian back into her arms. She cornered Sienna in the lobby of the Ashford building, sneering at her humble background and threatening to release the contract details to the conservative investors, ruining the merger Julian had worked so hard to secure. Clarissa demanded that Sienna pack her bags and walk away, or her son's face would be splashed across the tabloids. Sienna was terrified, but she did not run. She went straight to Julian, her voice trembling, but her chin held high as she told him everything. For the first time, they stood united against a common enemy. The climax arrived at the Ashford Group's annual charity gala, the very night the merger was to be publicly celebrated. Clarissa, dressed in a crimson gown, took the stage uninvited. With a triumphant smile, she grabbed the microphone and announced she had a voice recording that would expose the Ashford marriage as a complete fraud. The room plunged into shocked silence. Julian walked slowly to the center of the room, gently pulling Sienna to his side. He did not look at Clarissa. He looked at the foreign investors. He spoke with a quiet, undeniable authority. He admitted that their marriage had started as a business arrangement, a foolish attempt by a proud man to secure a deal. But then he looked down at Sienna, his voice softening. He told the crowd that the arrangement had failed because he had accidentally fallen deeply, irrevocably in love with his wife and her beautiful son. Before Clarissa could play her tape, Julian signaled his head of security. The speakers suddenly broadcasted a different recording. It was Clarissa, caught on tape just hours earlier, attempting to bribe a board member to vote Julian out of his own company. The investors looked at Clarissa with absolute disgust. Stripped of her power and humiliated in front of the city's elite, Clarissa fled the ballroom, her reputation ruined forever. Later that night, the penthouse was quiet, the city lights softly illuminating the living room. Julian stood before Sienna, all his corporate armor gone. He took her hands, his thumbs gently tracing her knuckles. He asked her to tear up the contract. He did not want a business partner. He wanted a wife. He promised to be a father to Leo, to build a life based on truth rather than transactions. Sienna looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerable, devoted man hiding beneath the billionaire exterior, and finally let herself fall. Years later, the relentless pace of Manhattan was far behind them. Julian had stepped down as the CEO of the Ashford Group, handing the reins to a trusted board, while he focused on managing a philanthropic foundation. They lived in a sprawling, sunlit estate by the coast. The sounds of the ocean were only interrupted by Leo laughing as he chased their golden retriever across the grass, while Sienna rested her head on Julian's shoulder, rocking their newborn daughter. They had left the world of cold contracts and bitter rivalries to build an empire of their own, one entirely made of love. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time. The reading of the will felt more like an execution than a memorial. Nathaniel Cross, a man whose heart was rumored to be forged from the same steel as his skyscrapers, sat perfectly still in the leather armchair. Across the heavy mahogany desk sat Victor Penhaligon, the family's long-time, deeply corrupt lawyer. Victor wore a smirk that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. The final clause of the late patriarch's testament was a bizarre, ironclad trap. To inherit the final block of voting shares and secure his absolute control over Cross Industries, Nathaniel had to be legally married within 14 days. If he failed, the shares would transfer to a blind trust controlled entirely by Victor. It was a calculated insult from a dead man, forcing his ruthless son to submit to the one institution he despised. Nathaniel stood up, straightening his impeccably tailored suit. He informed Victor that he would have a wife before the ink on the documents could dry, leaving the lawyer pale and furious in his wake. 2 days later, Nathaniel stalked through the sterile corridors of St. Jude Memorial, finalizing the massive endowment his father had left to the oncology ward. He was aggressively typing on his phone, barking orders at his broker, when he collided hard with someone carrying a tray of medical charts. The papers scattered across the linoleum. Nathaniel looked down, expecting apologies and subservience. Instead, he met the furious gaze of Margot Ellis. Margot was a dedicated nurse who had spent the last 12 hours fighting for the lives of strangers. She did not care about the bespoke cut of his suit or the recognizable arrogance in his jawline. She pointed a tired but steady finger at his chest and ordered him to turn off his phone in a quiet healing zone, calling him an overpaid nuisance with zero respect for human life. Nathaniel was stunned into silence. He watched her gather her charts, her spine rigid with pride. In that fleeting moment, he saw the solution to his impossible problem. She was fearless, unattached to high society, and clearly unimpressed by his wealth. He cornered her in the hospital cafeteria an hour later. The proposition was delivered with cold efficiency. He needed a wife on paper for 1 year. In exchange, he would pay off the crippling medical school debt she had mentioned to a colleague and fully fund the community clinic she dreamed of opening. Margot stared at his checkbook, her expression unreadable. She told him that she would take his money because it could save lives, but she would never be his obedient accessory. They signed the contract that evening. The wedding was a hollow, whispered affair in a judge's chambers. When Margot moved into the colossal Cross estate, She brought only 2 worn suitcases. Nathaniel expected her to revel in the luxury, to demand redesigns and shopping sprees. Instead, the tension between them crackled with every interaction. When he ordered his staff to deliver a diamond necklace to her room for an upcoming gala, Margot walked downstairs and dropped the velvet box onto his desk. She told him to keep his jewels, as she was a partner in a contract, not a pet to be decorated. Nathaniel tried to control her schedule, demanding she quit her grueling nursing shifts to be available for corporate dinners. Margot defied him openly, exposing the absolute emptiness of a life lived only for the accumulation of capital. She asked him when he had last looked at the sky without calculating the air rights. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel had no answer. The verbal sparring, initially hostile, slowly transformed into a desperate, unspoken attraction. The fragile balance shattered on a rainy Tuesday. Margot returned from a double shift, her face terrifyingly pale. Before she could reach the staircase, she collapsed on the marble floor. Nathaniel felt a terror he had never known. He rushed to her side, carrying her to the sofa, yelling for the staff to call a doctor. When the private physician arrived, the devastating truth was forced into the light. Margot had a rare, progressive heart condition, a secret she had hidden from everyone, even her colleagues. She confessed, her voice barely a whisper, that she had taken his contract because the money was the only way to afford the experimental treatments that might give her a few more years, while securing her younger sister's college tuition. She expected him to evict her for breaching their contract of transparency. Instead, the revelation tore through Nathaniel's defenses. The pain in his chest was a stark reminder of his own buried humanity. A cold rupture followed, but not the kind Margot expected. Nathaniel withdrew, consumed by a terrifying helplessness. He punished them both with silence, unable to articulate the depth of his fear. Yet, his actions spoke louder than any apology. He quietly fired the estate's kitchen staff and hired a specialized dietary chef. He cancelled international trips, working from the home library just to ensure she took her medications on time. One evening, finding her shivering on the patio, he did not say a word. He simply wrapped his own heavy cashmere coat around her shoulders and sat beside her until the sun went down, a silent vow of protection. But Victor Penhaligon had not been idle. The corrupt lawyer had noticed the lack of romance and hired a ruthless private investigator to dig into Margot's past. Discovering her medical records and the transactional nature of the marriage, Victor saw his golden opportunity. He planned a hostile board takeover, intending to leak Margot's condition and the fake marriage to the press, proving Nathaniel was committing corporate fraud and was unfit to inherit the shares. Victor cornered them at the annual Cross Industries shareholder banquet, his smile dripping with malice as he held up a sealed envelope containing Margot's medical files. Nathaniel did not flinch. He stood before the crowd of hungry investors and shielded Margot from their stares. He admitted nothing about the contract, but he did something Victor never anticipated. Nathaniel signaled his head of security. The doors to the banquet hall opened, and 2 police detectives walked in, accompanied by the private investigator Victor had hired. The investigator had been bought out by Nathaniel weeks ago and had spent his time unearthing Victor's own secrets. Nathaniel projected a series of offshore bank statements onto the main screen, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Victor had been embezzling millions from the Cross family trusts for over a decade. The room erupted in chaos. The satisfaction was absolute, as the detectives placed the stammering, humiliated lawyer in handcuffs, dragging him out of the room as the investors watched in stunned silence. That night, the massive estate felt different. The ghosts of the past had been banished. Nathaniel found Margot sitting by the fireplace, the glow reflecting in her tired but hopeful eyes. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. He told her that the contract was void. He did not want a business partner, and he did not care about the shares anymore. He offered her a genuine declaration of love, stripping away every ounce of his pride. He promised to spend every dollar and every waking moment finding a cure, fighting her illness by her side as her true husband. Margot pulled him into her arms, tears of genuine relief wetting his collar, finally allowing herself to be caught by the man who had promised to never let her fall. A year later, The world of boardrooms and corporate warfare seemed like a distant memory. On a sunlit cliffside overlooking the ocean, Nathaniel and Margot exchanged new vows, surrounded by genuine friends and a few bewildered executives. Margot, radiant and strong thanks to a successful new treatment program, smiled as Nathaniel kissed her. They had turned a desperate contract into an unbreakable bond, proving that sometimes the greatest wealth a man can possess is the woman who taught him how to live. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good love story. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time.